Okay, good evening, everybody. Our door has closed, so that means our lecture is about to start and no one may escape. I'm Freya Hartzell. For those of you who don't know me, I'm assistant professor here at Bard Graduate Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Paul and Irene Hollister Lecture. The Hollister Lectures on Glass are made possible through an endowment from Irene Hollister in memory of her late husband, Paul Hollister, a prolific glass historian who both taught the history of glass here at the BGC and also donated a wide range of glass-related books to our library before his passing in 2007. Even after Irene's own passing in 2016, her generous gift continues to support the study and research of glass here at the BGC in the form of faculty research fellowships, one of which is supporting my own research for a new book project on glass and transparency, as well as a digital exhibition and publication with the working title of Voices in Studio Glass History, which my colleague and co-convener of this lecture series, Professor Catherine Whalen, is producing with BGC's Associate Director of Visual Media Resources and Study Collection librarian Barb Elam, and the director of our Digital Media Lab, Jesse Morandi. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce tonight's Hollister lecturer, my colleague and friend Sandy Eisenstadt, professor of the History of Modern Architecture at the University of Delaware. Among his numerous claims to fame, Sandy is co-director of the University of Delaware's Center for Material Culture Studies, as well as president of the Society for Architectural Historians. His most recent book, Electric Light, An Architectural History, considers this artificial light as a new kind of building material during the modern period. His 2008 book, The Modern American House, Spaciousness and Middle-Class Identity, centers on the shaping of spatial perception in domestic settings. Sandy has also co-edited Modernism in the Middle East, Politics of the Built Environment, and this is the first book-length treatment of modern architecture in the Middle East, published in 2008, and also Cities of Light, 2 Centuries of Urban Illumination, the first global survey of urban lighting, published in January 2015. And very shortly, I think, Paul, right, coming out in our very own West 86th is Sandy's review of the Dieter Rams exhibition at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So we're looking forward to that as well. Prior to earning his PhD in architectural history from MIT, Sandy was a practicing architect in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and before that worked in Manhattan and the Bronx in the low-income housing and nonprofit economic development sectors, which I think is pretty interesting. I personally am really looking forward to Sandy's talk tonight because it promises to explore all of my favorite things: glass, transparency, modernism, interiors, literature, and haunted houses. So please help me welcome Professor Sandy Eisenstadt.
Thanks so much, Freya. Thank you all for coming. I didn't know you liked haunted houses. Well, there are a few of them tonight. So thanks also to the Hollisters for this lecture series. I'm really happy to be part of it. I will be talking not so much about glass, but what glass enables and how changes in the built environment can lead to changes partly in architecture, certainly, but also in behavior and even in cultural imagination. So really, I'm talking about how large sheets of flat glass, so it's not decorative or cut glass or studio glass, but it's really flat glass, and how that led to certain changes in our understanding of the domestic realm, and also in ways that the domestic realm can unravel. Okay, let's start. In the opening scene of The Birds, the 1963 Alfred Hitchcock thriller, Melanie Daniels, on your left, played by Tippi Hedren, is meeting Mitch Brenner, on your right, played by Rod Taylor, in a pet shop in San Francisco. And they meet over this pair of lovebirds in a cage, which you can see right at the center. So in light of what follows, and I'm presuming everyone knows this movie, or at least knows what goes on in it, it's very clear that the pair of lovebirds represents the ideal relationship between mankind and nature as mankind imagines it. That's a really important part of this. The metal cage is just a trifle for human industry, but it's the instrument that makes this relationship possible. And it relies upon a benevolent and even a kind of adorable character of nature. So pretty soon, nature rebels. Ordinary birds are deformed into avian rage. They're kind of possessed by this malevolent spirit, and they represent a different kind of nature, a nature, as Tennyson put it, a nature red in tooth and claw, or red in beak and claw, I guess, in this case. In the most dramatic scene, I think, of the whole movie, Tippi Hedren finds herself in this phone booth, unable to escape, helplessly buffeted by roiling skies of angry birds. There, I said it. And she's now the one in a cage, and the cage is a glass box. The glass box is an archetype. This phone booth in particular is an archetype, if ever there was one, for the modern house. There's a woman at the center of it. It's protected by a thin metal frame, and it's entirely open to nature through walls of glass. But this is not your mama's modern house. Horrified, Hedren can do nothing but look at the view. And the view is awful. Birds are, if you've seen this, birds are flinging themselves at the glass. There's a carriage, a horse-drawn carriage, and an automobile that comes kind of careening towards the phone booth. There's a man who's having the life pecked out of him trying to get in, and she just is a little horrified by all of that. It's nature turned inside out. It's this benevolent notion of nature turned rageful. And what's kind of amazing about the scene is there are no words in it. It's just birds screeching, and it's 2 minutes and 7 seconds. I didn't bring it because it's just too scary. But what it does is it shows that walls of glass are suddenly a kind of weakness. They function as intended only when nature is kind of at rest. So there's Tippi Hedren looking out at the view. And the context I want to put this in is the modern house. Looking out at the landscape through walls of glass was a signal achievement of modern architecture and became a kind of symbolic gesture of modernism. It's based on glass as a relatively new material, and it's based on new ideas of domesticity. It's actually an idea that predates the modern movement as we know it from, say, the teens and 20s, but it's one that a kind of avant-garde modernism picks up on, certainly in the 20s and 30s, and makes it really central to its own self-representation. So here is someone looking at a benevolent nature that we know at any moment it could like turn nasty. So here you can see, is that? No. Okay, so there's a house by Richard Neutra from 1932 in an advertisement by Libby Owens Ford, and then a more general notion of views of kind of benevolent landscape through the glass wall. And the point here is simply that glass manufacturers were only too happy to advertise and help further the kind of consumption and use of glass in avant-garde work, and also as a much more of a vernacular element. And this is part of what leads to the idea of, so here you can see, right, the large sheets of glass are also a kind of symbol of progress, and they also give you access to this, again, a kind of benevolent nature. And it forms also the basis for the picture window, the great icon of mid-century modern design. And you can just see, you know, this is reasonable enough, but you get these kinds of ridiculous visualizations of what a more or less suburban landscape would be looking at. The great thing about the birds is that, you know, quite literally, it's the crack in the picture window, which was the title of a 1954 book by the author John Keats about, in part, how this idea of picture windows in suburbs is pretty unworkable, but also the suburbs themselves, in many ways, are largely unworkable. So there are many anxieties in this post-war era. We have the development of the nuclear industry, the start of the Cold War. intercontinental nuclear-tipped missiles, the start of the Eisenhower era military-industrial complex, growing skepticism about technology, rapid urbanization and deurbanization, demographic change. But there's one anxiety in particular that locates itself in relation to the modern house, and that is this notion that the bucolic setting is somehow infiltrated or overturned by a nature that seems kind of bent on revenge. And The Birds is really just one example of this. There are a number of post-war stories and films that talk about a haunted setting for the private house, where formerly there was the house itself would have been haunted. So the question I want to ask tonight is, how did this situation come about? How did we shift from the haunted house to the haunted landscape? And how did the bucolic landscape kind of erupt into horror? So as a spoiler alert, it has to do with glass. It's sort of a complicated argument, so I just want to give you a summary right now and then go into it in a little bit of depth. In the 19th century, character was a leading category for assessing the architectural merit of a single-family house and the virtue of the family that lived within it. In the passage from the 19th century to the 20th century, character shifted in terms of where and how it was localized. In the 19th century, character is part of the physical fabric of the house. With modernism, character comes to be located in the landscape, and character goes from a public expression of personal virtue in the 19th century with the 19th century house to a kind of private visual landscape that's given over to gratification. So the locus, the site for judging the character of the house, shifts from the center of the house, often focused on key elements like at the heart of the house, like literally the hearth, with family gathered around it, including in this image from about the 1870s, fireside stories where the mother is literally recounting the history of the family in tiles on the hearth. That shifts to a view of the outside. So here I'm going to discuss this shift in relationship to a particular genre of literature, that is haunted house stories. It's a literature that first appears in the late 18th century, and that is exactly the time, like to the minute, when professional architects start talking about single-family houses as a kind of focus for design. And both literatures, that is 18th century, starting in the 18th century, house design manuals and haunted house stories as they go through the 19th century, they both presume this kind of reciprocity of house and the self, the people that are occupying the house. So, okay, that's the summary. Now a little bit more detail. So the idea of character has picturesque origins, let's just say the 18th century. And I'm showing you an image from about 1852. And this is showing the different styles of house for a particular site. So you have houses that are more or less beautiful and large and wealthy. A house that would be considered sublime. It's on this kind of precipitous, it's on a cliff. So I don't know what if you want to get pizza at night or something, I wouldn't advise it. These beautiful houses, and I'm using kind of picturesque era categories, are on the smooth, flat areas. They're very symmetrical. Here, the focus is the picturesque house, which has purposefully designed asymmetry. It's kind of shaggy in character. It's tucked away in nature. And this is really the first moment, many of you probably know this, the first moment that asymmetry becomes an explicit design principles after millennia of emphasis on symmetry, certainly in Western architecture. So character's never really defined precisely, which I think is part of its power. And it is part of this picturesque era subjective aesthetics, which we can talk about afterwards. But the key thing is that it's based on how the mind is affected by what it sees. It's based on kind of psychological effects. So in many cases, the house is related to the landscape. Designers started talking about ways that the particular setting should inform the house. It should take on the colors of local materials or be built with local materials. It should show the effects of time in some sense. It could be kind of shaggy. Asymmetry was thought to be a kind of concession to the realities of a program or change over time, and therefore asserted a kind of, let's say, just a kind of practical concession to convenience rather than sort of high-blown classical principles of design. And that, again, reflects on the character of the owners. So dwellings were said not only to reflect the particularities of the site, but to reflect the character of the occupants here. So here in this Currier and Ives print from the mid-19th century, you can see the family is sheltered by the house, but they're also kind of represented by their larger setting and clearly away from the image of labor, and certainly any hint of an urban setting is literally kind of closed off in front of the family. Ralph Waldo Emerson, in an essay in the mid-19th century titled Character, even linked this idea about the connection between the family and the house to the national character. And he said, character is the larger moral order seen through the medium of an individual nature, by the nature of the individual person. So the house could kind of resonate with all of this. And it's important to remember that real property was the basis for, having a voice in government, having any kind of standing in society. Possession of real property was a key to a kind of recognized citizenship. And these are the days before credit is readily available. So, you don't build anything really unless you have the money for it. But if you did want to get some money from a lender, the lender, and there are no kind of standardized banks, you would, your credit worthiness would be assessed by a kind of canvassing of your family, your friends, neighbors, merchants, who would attest to your character. Were you a good person? Were you careful with your money? Were you, and it was only men, obviously, who were questioned about this, but did you have the free labor of a wife and child? These were all elements that could make you credit worthy. As the Reverend Everett Hale said in 1874, land and personal character were these two legs of social standing, quote, real estate, the only estate except character, which is real. And this was especially true in the United States with a widespread use of fee simple ownership to a degree unlike anywhere else in the world at that time, where a simple house could stand in for a range of American virtues, including kind of hardworking humility. So, with moral, financial, and aesthetic factors bearing on the architectural character of a single-family house, homeownership became a vehicle for an emblem of self-determination, which is why I think the most revealing insight into character comes from the literature where selfhood comes undone. That is, Tales of the Haunted House. A reciprocity between the house and the self, again, underpins not only haunted house literature, but also the design literature from the 18th and early 19th century. One literature tells you how to put houses together, the other describes how they fall apart. So in the American setting, Edgar Allan Poe is easily the best example of this sort of literature, as the entwining of the house and the occupant is a recurrent theme for him. It's an obsessive theme for him. It's everywhere. The horror is always under the floorboards. People pull up the floorboards in the Telltale Heart, or it's behind the wall. Someone gets buried in the wall. So I think one of the things Poe is trying to tell us is that what we take for reality is really paper thin. It's just this kind of veil, and right behind it is horror. He's great. So, so undoing the structure in Poe, tearing down a wall, revealing something, reveals this kind of the true character of the place. It's a reversal of construction that Poe thematizes in the haunted house literature, which he develops, obviously, but also in the detective story, which he invents. Poe invents the detective story. And to detect means literally, etymologically, to take the roof off, to pull apart the construction. The tect in detect is the tect in architect. It's the same word, the same root. It's the same text in textile. So from the Greek terms, you would have this kind of weaving together. The archi, the master tecton, was the person who put it all together. The detective, or in Poe's haunted house stories, is the person who kind of pulls this all apart. So what you find is that, and these are two images from the fall of the House of Usher. You might remember Roderick and Madeline, I think. They kind of share a soul with the house. Here they are kind of in front of some sort of fireplace, and their family they've squandered the family fortune. Their house is decaying. They're decaying souls. So it's really no coincidence that this loss of self-control is looked at as a loss of familial control over, generational resources, and also related to the decay of the house itself. So that's character and haunted houses in the 19th century. As we turn into the 20th century, what's happening is that houses are getting mass-produced more and more. They're larger. Developers are making larger and larger subdivisions, and there's quite a bit of complaining on the part of architects and people who are kind of let's say, trying to preserve cultural traditions, who are complaining about this. So this is from a 1914 book by Ruby Goodnow, and she's discussing this house, what it would look like if the designer had known about architecture. And this is modern American domestic architecture, alas. And I just draw your attention to not just the sort of loss of a certain details like these shutters, but also the large panes of glass that are coming into more and more common use. So glass had been a very costly material in the 19th century. The U.S. is actually there are a number of factories that try to make the best glass, plate glass, but the U.S. is unable to do that. If you had plate glass, you could buy insurance policies for your plate glass windows. And homes wouldn't have it, but shops might in cities, because it was expensive enough. By the end of the 19th century, flat glass becomes cheaper and cheaper. More and more clients start calling for it. They want it. And architects are kind of upset about that because, again, they've been designing building facades for a really long time very carefully, and clients are like, make the windows bigger. The glass is going to be a cheap part of it. So here's what Goodnow is saying in regard to these images. Quote, large windows shatter the sense of enclosure necessary for the creation of domestic character. People demand windows everywhere! Exclamation point. Each room must have 2 and often 3! Exclamation point. She's very upset. And she continues, in architecture, the important thing is to express the character of a building. On looking at a building, we should be able to say by its appearance to what purpose it is put. We associate our ideas of home with a certain snugness, a certain security. It is this quality which makes the difference in character between a public building and a home. This feeling vanishes if we try to imagine a house that is all windows. So this is simply happening. Again, architects are sort of resisting in various ways. The window manufacturers are only too happy to promote the use of large windows. And this is possibly one of my favorite images. It's actually remarkably complex because it's about the transparency of windows. And I think it's a 4-way transparency. So first, here's the architect talking to the couple, right? He's talking through glass, but because the glass is so clear, he knows everything he's saying will be heard by this couple. the guy is listening. He likes what he's hearing. And, whatever the architect is saying, he's getting 100% of it, again, because the glass is clear. The wife, in character, is daydreaming. She's just looking at how beautiful this house is. She's looking through the glass. We, the customers, are getting every word of what Livy Owens Ford is saying about this. So we're the sort of fourth audience for this. And it's crystal clear, again, because of this like fourfold transparency of the glass. So this kind of notion of that transparency of the glass is I just want to point this out, it's already present regardless of any kind of modern movement in architecture. And it is something, as I said, that modernists kind of pick up on. I mean, obviously they know about it, but when European modernists come to the United States, they sort of change a lot of their rationales for the use of glass in particular. So modernism flat out rejects this notion of character. These are some character studies, different kinds of roofs meant to be kind of evocative, picturesque, something that summons up certain sentiments. This is from the 1930s, Alfred Bemis, Rational Housing. This is all about being much more reasonable, focusing on questions of function, embracing mass production, being forthright about it. So this is sort of the argument that modernists are making, is that when you attend to the rational kind of development of the plan and the function of specific elements, questions about character, sentiment, other types of conventions just go out the window. And so modernists, this is Richard Neutra's 1927-29 Level House in Los Angeles. The argument here is that if you attend to all of the functional aspects and use the most modern materials, think about modern life, then you don't need old-fashioned notions of character. And in fact, part of the problem of these older idea of characters is that they could be faked. They could be added on in this sort of pasteboard ornament. So I'm showing you an image from 1909. This is Governor Atterbury's design for Forest Hills Gardens. Atterbury was a really up-to-date architect. He used these prefabricated lift slab construction for Forest Park Gardens, but then it's kind of what would have been understood at the time, sort of tricked out in much more conventional sets of forms. And it's exactly this idea that the more avant-garde, the more outspoken modern architects sort of rebelled against. And by the mid-century, you would hear charges of facadism. And facadism, the facade, right? So before the 20th century, the facade is a very complex interface between inside and outside that's worth a lot of design attention. It's actually technically a really important plane that's worth architects paying attention to. But now in the 20th century, facade becomes this kind of object of scorn. The facade is the face that belongs to other people. And there are even individuals who related this to David Reisman's, the sociologist David Reisman's famous discussion of the other-directed personality. That is, I do things so that you will see me a certain way. I'm not being true to myself, but I care about your opinion of me. And that's one of the core two types that he identifies. So facade, the idea of facade is linked to that. So what you get is this emphasis on modern construction. Here we can see George Howe's 1939 Fortune Rock House at Mount Desert Island. He actually uses a lot of vernacular elements like this kind of stone base, but he has these big concrete beams, and most prominently, the house has this kind of almost like bellows-like element that comes out of the living room and focuses on the view. Again, there's a woman looking at the view, and I show this to you because this is 1939. There's now, and I really date it to this moment, there's now a kind of shift in the representation of modern architecture where the house that's being represented here occupies, like, I don't know, an eighth of the image. The merit, the character of the house, its architectural value is what's seen from the house. So this is the earliest image I've found of this in relation to modern architecture. There's some earlier examples that aren't explicitly modern. So the basic point here is that with this idea of character so permeating American popular consciousness and unconsciousness for that matter, it would be surprising for a character to have disappeared altogether. And in fact, I think it goes, in general terms, it migrates into a notion of personality. So by 1930, you get Emily Post's Personality of a House. So we stop talking about character for the most part. Maybe recently we've talked about character a lot, but we won't go there. And it kind of morphs into this notion of personality, but in architectural terms, character moves out into the landscape. So remember, these modern houses have simplified geometries, mass-produced materials, and they're not designed with attention to this older notion of character, but there's still this idea of character that's around, but it goes out into the landscape. So this is an image of a Richard Neutra house from the early 50s in Montecito, the Tremaine house. I actually had the opportunity to talk to the photographer, Julius Schulman, a well-known mid-century photographer, and he told me that Neutra always looked through the viewfinder to find out what he was looking at. He was never allowed just to take a shot. But Neutra also had big lunches and would take a nap after lunch. And when Neutra was lunching or napping, Schulman went to the roof of the Tremaine house and took this view of the valley, so the kind of Pacific is probably right behind him. And then a few weeks later, Neutra sees it in Schulman's studio, and he says, that's it. That's what my architecture is about. And then in 1951, Neutra uses this as the cover for a book that he writes. So again, this sort of image of the house, the merit of the house as being what can be seen from it. Marcel Breuer's houses were sometimes described as observation posts, places to look at nature. This house in Connecticut was described as looking like a camera, and probably the height of this is the 1937 Razor House by Mies van der Rohe, the first project he does in the United States after he comes from Germany. And here he's imagining this glass-walled house entirely as a view. So this one is sort of a perspective. They're both sort of perspectives. Here's a column, and here's a column on one side, a column on the other side, and then the view of the Tetons, and then there you can see the view, and then some of the artwork and finishes that were within it. But again, the point here is that this becomes a kind of commonplace notion that the view, what you see outside is part of the inside, or another way to think about it is the biggest thing on the inside of the house is the view of the outside of the house. And this becomes a really central element for at least a lot of the rhetoric of design at mid-century. And of course, it relies on a really kind of domesticated landscape. The world itself has to be housebroken in order for houses to open up to them. It's a real idea of nature. And a lot of the suburban developments, discussions of the suburbanites were about the new pioneers. They don't wear doeskin breeches anymore, but they're still these kind of hardy settlers. There are numerous accounts of that. And this visual thrust of the view, you even find in a number of cases where it literally is like carving its way through the fireplace, the former symbol of the house. So here's another Breuer house where the view is just kind of chipping away at the hearth, or, again, just sort of popular versions of trying to combine what had been a conventional architectural element and symbol of the center of the house, now pushed to the periphery and somehow realigned with this new element of character in the house, that is the view. And then I just show this because it's funny. So this is from a design manual, and it's showing the desirability and effects and kind of appropriateness for large windows. So you can see here, in a kitchen, bedroom, and bathroom, having a 3-foot tall window is fine. In a living room, you really want the bigger opening, the picture window, but what's great about it is in the kitchen, the couple are upright, looking at the view. As the window gets bigger, they're sitting down, relaxing. The guy takes out his pipe. When the window is 6 feet high, the wife has disappeared. She's turned into a cocktail. It's just kind of leaning back. So it's a kind of remarkable effect of the view. And in fact, there was one psychologist, Otto Fenichel, who said that clients of modern houses were more emotionally secure than other people, and they didn't need to project all these things like gables and shutters because they knew who they were. They only cared about the technical needs for developing a better life. So again, I'm sort of talking about this swath from high to low about big glass and views. And just to press the point a little bit further, you have the Housing and Home Finance Agency, an element of the United States government, saying that view is now part of the house. So you don't necessarily own things out in the view, and this is a whole longer discussion. Real estate appraisers only in the 1930s start talking about how view adds value to the house. Before that, if you had a big view, you owned a lot of land, period. These views on land on picturesque estates, they had 80,000 acres. These are very small sites, so they're talking about views. Don't have an urban view, right? This is all, I'm not going into it, but this is all part of an urban critique as well. Have a private view with natural elements. Check the view. So the view is part of the kind of economic underpinning of the house. And really importantly, it's unpopulated. So this is a problem in suburbs that are relatively dense. And you start getting a lot of criticisms of the picture window and large glass in suburban settings. It's not that workable. So there are these picturesque, these humorous elements, right? The filler brush man or these, neighbors looking at the view, but it's the neighbor looking at the view, that's your view. But there are also some criticisms that start getting just kind of unsettling. So here, you live in a show window too, and they're selling carpets, but the idea is that all the neighbors are going to see your carpeting through your big windows. But just the visual representation's a little on the creepy side. Or this from House Beautiful, and you might know Elizabeth Gordon had this whole kind of the editor of House Beautiful had a kind of xenophobic view of architecture. So this is part of her kind of stewardship. Is there a picture in your picture window? And here, you can see the family. I can't quite point to it, but are you making a nice picture for the neighbors to see? And they look a little robotic, don't they? And this is probably, maybe it's around 55. In 1956, we have Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And the brilliant thing about that movie, and there were a lot of actually alien invasion movies in the 1950s, but I think the thing that was so enduring about the Body Snatchers is it was your neighbors. Your neighbors they start out as your friends, then they turn out to be these soulless automata bent on destroying you, making you one of them. So it's the perfect image of this kind of anxiety about suburban conformity. So, and it's also this notion of a collapse of social distance. So again, one of the things I want to point out is that apron of lawn was meant to be a kind of buffer between other people, and maintaining a social distance was a really important element. So one of the point I think I want to make here is that the horror comes not from within the house, but it's from this kind of collapse of social distance. So one of the first writers who really thematizes this is Shirley Jackson. Maybe you've heard of her. In 1948, she published her first published article was The Lottery. Did people read The Lottery in high school? Yeah, I remember The Lottery. Right, it's anthologized quite a bit, and I think a lot of people encounter it in high school. So it is the story of what turns out to be a kind of town gathering in a small rustic town, but everyone is like-minded to the point of murder, and they kill one of the townspeople. And again, it's a kind of critique in a way of conformity. About 10 years later, she writes this story called The Sundial, a short novel, and this is about the Halloran family. Most of the action takes place inside the house, but there's a garden that's always visible through these big windows that has this, and there's a sundial that's weirdly off-center in an otherwise symmetrical garden. And it keeps recurring throughout the story as this kind of indication or symbol of the decay of the family. But probably her best-known full-length novel of horror is The Haunting of Hill House from 1959. And there's, can I just ask what time it is?
It is 6:45.
Oh, it is? Oh, so I should move, right? All right, sorry. So The Haunting of Hill House, most of the action takes place inside the house, which is trying to seduce Eleanor Vance, who's this kind of asocial, nervous type figure. But she ends up dying out in the landscape as she's driving in her car, looking through the windshield, another piece of flat glass, and sees a ghost and smashes into this tree that's kind of been brooding there the entire time. And what's most suggestive, I think, about Shirley Jackson is her lesser-known career writing stories about happy families with kind of lovable mishaps for shelter magazines like McCall's and Woman's Day and House Beautiful. And probably the best-known novel of that genre is Life Among the Savages. So by day, she writes about these happy families in the suburbs with bumbling husbands. And at night, she writes about this literature that just splashes through them. So there are a number of other examples. The Incredible Shrinking Man, this Richard Matheson novel from 1956, where Scott Carey here, he's shrinking, and his lawn, he's looking out through his window at his lawn. The lawn is occupied by other people who are trying to look at him. He ends up living in this dollhouse. He opens the door. He looks through the window. There's this cat trying to kill him. It's his family cat. There's the lawn now, which is this scene of horror. And then what should have been a kind of glass opening and a generous kind of aperture onto the outside is now a cage that's preventing him from escaping. I think in this instance, he's in the basement and it's a big spider trying to kill him. So there are a number of stories. Stephen King's Lawnmower Man is one of these. Poltergeist from the early 80s by Stephen King. The owner of the house, Steve Freeling, is a real estate agent. They want to build a backyard swimming pool, and so they excavate, and this releases spirits from the ground. The kid is attacked by a tree, it's sort of, the tree is trying to eat him. So elements of the landscape are not behaving nicely. But the novel that I think thematizes landscape as haunted the most is something called The House Next Door by Anne Rivers Siddons. And in this, there's a couple, Walter and Colquitt Kennedy. And Colquitt spends a lot of time in the house looking out the window. Her house is next to an unbuildable lot. It's a suburb, but the lot next door has some rocks and weird topography, so no one can build there. So she really takes advantage of the privacy. She walks out naked quite a bit. She just loves her private world. A genius architect, Kim Doherty, figures out how to build there. He's sort of modeled on Frank Lloyd Wright, and he's described as being really an advocate of organic architecture, and this house is understood to be so organic that it kind of emanates from the ground. It's something that rises up from the ground. And the people that move into this house, which the couple, the Kennedys, acknowledge as a masterpiece, they end up having, there are all kinds of calamities. People die. People have all kinds of diseases and death. And then finally, the wife tells the police, and what happens next is that the neighbors shun her. She has disclosed the secrets of the suburb. She's told other people about it. So what they do in this sort of ending scene is they vandalize her lawn. So they ruin her view, and she actually says that what she calls the shattering disclosure, this exposure to others, was something that could not be countenanced. And she says, quote, "In distance there is decency." So the suburban house is supposed to support this kind of distance, but it ends up here, the horror is that it's been lost. And there's only, you can see how many editions of this there were. There's only one cover that I think is really appropriate, which shows, you know, it's a modern house with these big glass windows. So there's an urban version of this, of course. Rear Window, I'm not going to talk about that. But I think, and then we get to the birds. And again, you know, you kind of have this story of meeting in San Francisco, people escaping this indoor kind of diner, Tippi Hedren going into the phone booth, getting attacked by the birds shatter the glass, then Rod Taylor rescues her. And one of the things I noticed in rewatching this is that the plot is not advanced at all by the scene. You learn nothing new with it. It's an amazing scene. It's the most dramatic scene. But there's no development of character or anything. It's simply so powerful that Hitchcock put it in. And again, I take it as a kind of metaphor for the modern house. So let me just tell you point to one more example, and that is The Shining. The Shining by Stephen King. The Shining takes place in a hotel called The Outlook. It's called The Outlook because it has the best views in the whole country. And even though it's a hotel, it's home to a single family over the course of the winter. Or, you know, as we find out, a series of families, but I'll save that for later. And in fact, Jack Nicholson in the movie, I think the movie's 1980, the book is 78. Jack Nicholson, or in the book, the character Jack Durrance actually says, this hotel is an index of all of America. And the book even begins, the novel begins with an epigraph from Poe's Fall of the House of Usher. So it's really clear what I think King is gesturing towards. So what we have here is, here's, you can see, right, Jack Torrance, Jack Nicholson, who has this overview of the garden. And so the book is slightly different from the movie. In the book, you might know the stories, right? It's Danny is the son who has this super empathetic quality that is called The Shining. He's able to relate to other people. It's exactly the opposite of his father, who's neurotically self-involved. And one of the reasons they're here is because Jack wants to be a writer, so he thinks the isolation of this house, the isolation of the suburbs will help him blossom his kind of creative abilities. It turns out that it was simply, you know, this kind of exaggerated isolation. And then you probably know this great kind of, well, you know what, I'm just going to show it to you, this great segue between Shelley Duvall, I forgot the little boy's name, walking through the topiary gardens. And in the novel itself, the gardens are kind of alive. They have animal shapes. They scratch at you as you walk by. But here they're mastering it. And there's the Jack Nicholson in the house. So I'll just quickly show you the clip because the reason I want to show it is it's an image of transparency that not even glass can offer, the glass of modernism. It's a total interpenetration of inside and outside. So you might know, if you've seen the movie, Jack Nicholson dies in that same topiary, even though right before he had like an uber view of it, right? He had the total view, but he still can't master it. He has a bad relationship with nature, even though the house and nature are really closely parallel. So just to sort of summarize and wrap it up, between the mid-19th and the mid-20th century, architectural character shifts in location from the fabric of the house to the house's relationship with the landscape. And this shift is made possible by large pieces of glass. The shift is a shift in purpose as well, moving from a representation of the homeowner's moral fiber to become a kind of protective perimeter necessary to assure the individual gratification of the occupants. And the house shifts also as being a kind of vehicle for socialization to become a bastion of privacy. Modernism contributes to the shift in a number of planned ways that we can talk about later, but primarily here because of the use of large pieces of glass and also this emphasis on visual relations with the landscape, private views to the outdoors. Anxieties, Anxieties regarding character, as seen through the haunted house literature in the 19th century, focus on the unseen presence of irrational parts of a complicated and historical psyche that's revealed through the disassembly of the house or the self. By the mid-20th century, they center on the collapse of social distance or this idea that the surrounding landscape, this protective perimeter, has somehow become hostile. So from a reasoned deconstruction of the irrational embodied in the physical fabric to this unsettling effect of being exposed to a hostile exterior. So the one admission I have to make is I really don't like horror literature. It scares me, and I find daily life really scary enough as it is, so I don't need this literature. I read The Shining like this at noon next to a playground. It's frightening. So I just want to end with the heteronormative white couple. They're flying their magic carpet. It's actually a blueprint of a house that they're going to occupy. You get the critique of the city that they're flying far above. And at this point, it's all just a big, beautiful promise. And, you know, let's hope their dreams come true. So, thank you. Oh, we do? Okay. Okay, so if there are questions, I thought I was behind. All right. I don't know if there are questions, or comments, or concerns. Abina.
So are you implying that modernist, like architecture, like homes, are completely devoid of character?
Would I say that? No. But I think that a lot of the rhetoric of modern architecture was that you had to attend to the kind of satisfaction of functions. You had to pay attention to the needs of the clients. You had to think about construction, and that the character of the house would kind of arise from that. So that's sort of, I mean, the difficulty here is like kind of mush together, let's say, high and low. So I think the avant-garde architects were saying we don't even need to think about character. They are, I mean, clearly, but they're not talking about that. And then what's happening in the sort of vernacular developer tradition is that there are critiques of the suburbs that are saying these houses are without character, they're all the same. And so you get some discussions, and we've looked at not just design journals, but even real estate journals that say what you should do is in a suburb where all the houses are the same, you can have different plantings and create, this is a quote, artificial view. And that will give your mass-produced house a kind of individual character. So, I mean, that's a great question because character is still there. It's simply a term that's at that point is not used that much, and it's part of this kind of critique even of the 19th century. Yes, Pat.
Actually, before you pointed out a sublime, what you called a sort of sublime building on a big cliff that reminded me actually of a Robert Adam building. Anyway, I had been thinking about the sublime and this thing about fear, and whether it's right or wrong, the reason that I sort of left proper history for the history of taste was sort of reading around the sublime, and I'm trying to think where the hell it was now, but this notion of, I guess it's probably improvements in travel, but really the shift towards, naming and thinking about the sublime, the notion that people would travel through the Alps with the blinds down because of the fear of this, just maybe bandits as well. I mean, but the fear of what was outside and also not wanting to admire it. And then, blinds up and whole discourse to whoever you're travelling with about the beauty. So it just seemed to me that, it's around the same time as you're looking at, but just slightly different. Or is it the same thing?
No, I think that's the whole point of the picturesque as it's defined by Price and something like that is it's the sublime is not an everyday feeling. It's it's the roller coaster. That's super exciting, but you can't, nothing you can do all day long.
I guess what I'm thinking about is that fear before the sublime. What's worse than the sublime?
Yeah.
Jack Nicholson, The
Right.
Shining is worse.
But I think that's I think there's, I hadn't thought of it that way, but there's, if you think of the picturesque as the kind of mediation of the beautiful and the sublime in that kind of 18th century formulation, in some way, I'm thinking like with the Jack Nicholson, there's something, beautiful and picturesque about that, but this sublime horror rips through it. That's actually, and I hadn't thought about it that way. That the sublime, that is in a sense repressed or managed with the picturesque, rips through. And I'm thinking now of some of the other horror stories or films. You could probably make the same argument.
Well, this is the uncanny, right? This is the third term, I think, is the uncanny. And I don't know if I didn't want to cut Pat off. But yeah, my question was, are you aware of Lily Tomlin's Incredible Shrinking Woman?
No.
I
don't want to be.
Yeah, you should be. But the second, more serious question is about this uncanny, right? This sort of flip or shift from the sublime to the uncanny. And I'm thinking of Tony Vidler's discussion of we happen to actually be reading this for class this week about transparency. The piece that we're not reading is his haunted house piece, where he talks about this feeling of that it's within this feeling of coziness that you can have the horror story, because and there's this strange dynamic of being kind of enclosed and in comfort at the same time that you're kind of imagining this horrific, chilling thing. And I wonder if that's something that's
that's the case. So the uncanny, so the German the unheimlich, the unhomelike. So you need the home-like to be established first. So in all of this literature, it all starts out as a great promise of home and comfort, and then there are these unfamiliar elements. And I think the way, I don't know what the threshold is between uncanny and sublime horror. Though I guess the sublime is where, in the Burke definition of it, it's you're not imperiled, right? It's horrible, but you're not afraid for your life. Whereas in The Shining, get out. Right?
It's intruding into your own experience.
Yeah. So it goes beyond there are elements that are uncanny, but then it goes beyond that to real peril. So I don't know. It's an interesting question where it would fall in those categories. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. So this is somewhere between a question and a comment. As full disclosure, as a person who works on early modern Europe, I couldn't help thinking about something that happens in the 15th century, which is sort of the discovery of nature and the villa culture and all of that, which there's a similar rhetoric about the view and about situating buildings so they can take advantage of nature, and that obviously leads directly into the 18th century, the Burke Sublime and all of that. But there's a kind of whole other side that is kind of in your work. I think it's there about nature, and you don't really bring that out because I guess you're trying to emphasize glass today, but really just about the relationship between structures and nature and how that changes over time and how it becomes, first it's scary, before the villa and before people figure out how to domesticate nature in the 15th century, and then it becomes kind of wealth and status, and then it becomes sort of domesticated as suburban life, and then it becomes scary again with these films. So, I mean, we're cycling around these same issues.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, is that from like Ackerman's villa?
Yeah, I mean, that's yes. And from yes, Ackerman kind of essentializes a lot of texts that are being written. I mean, Alberti, it goes back. But I think it's a very important way of thinking about nature and the idea of glass and the addition of technology, where you can basically be outdoors, indoors, is something that they couldn't do in the 15th century because there wasn't they didn't play glass and they couldn't build windows that large. Although then I was thinking about cathedrals and about all kinds. There's all kinds of implications. So
I mean, that's what's I think fascinating is that there are. There might be longer themes, but there are also these technological developments, so these changes in the built environment that lead to differences in how things are imagined. So people, like the landscape architects of the 18th and 19th century, resisted this idea of seeing their work through windows. And there are people like Humphrey Repton who talk about that you shouldn't be looking at the landscape from inside because it precludes movement. And movement through the landscape is absolutely key to the picturesque. And then there are people later on, as windows get bigger, who say this is great in terms of visual access, but I can't feel the wind. I can't hear the birds. So this is, in terms of the disaggregation of the sensorial, this is a real problem. So I think you're right. It has everything to do with different notions of nature and the perceptual mechanisms in relationship to that nature. Yes?
So you're talking about transparency in relationship to glass, but I was wondering if you could speak more about how the other material properties of glass and how that comes into your understanding of the sublime or the uncanny in terms of how glass is simultaneously both understood as impenetrable but also brittle, or the reflective nature of glass. Like, how does that play into you?
Yeah, I think what I've picked up on is a certain thread in the literature and kind of visual representations of glass. There are other elements, like I just said, the fact that it provides visual access, but none of the other senses can penetrate it. The reflective properties are picked up by some people. You can think of Mies van der Rohe as, kind of obsessed with reflections, and others as well. But this, and maybe the one way to reframe the question is, why in this context is the transparency so valued over all the other factors?
Okay.
So in fact, one of the big issues, and I just touched on it with that, you live in a show window image, is that there's the view out, but it's reversible, right? And this is the threat of people in the landscape. So interior designers who are not necessarily, kind of aligned perfectly with avant-garde modernists, they were really concerned about these large windows, and they talked about the black square of night. That was this kind of ominous presence in your house, and you needed big curtains. An architect like Neutra, who's an avant-garde architect, he can't abide curtains. So he develops this whole system of under soffit lighting on the outside, so he can light the window from outside the house, so you won't get the effect of this black square of night. So Basically, I guess in answer to your question, I've identified a particular thread. I would argue it's the main point of discussion of transparency, and this is true in the U.S. and in Europe. They're like, is there or not there? There's a lot of discussion about that. But you do find sort of around the margins a lot of discussion about the other properties of glass. I don't know if that kind of addresses that. Yeah, there's more. Yes.
So I don't know if this is fair, but I was wondering if you could extend your thesis to the present day when we are seeing so many glass towers and it's actually obligatory for developers building any kind of, luxury apartment buildings to have bigger and bigger windows. Hudson Yards is full of them. So I mean, where would you take these ideas?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole urban dimension. So the first thing I would do is I'd put it in that urban category. But there's no question that the views represent power in a lot of ways. I mean, everyone's been in a tall building, and it's a powerful moment, and if you feel like you own that view, and there's a whole discussion, I can go into it, it'll be boring, but adjudication of the view, ways that people can own views that they don't own, where they don't own the lands underneath them. And this has been to the Supreme Court. And actually, I just parenthetically, I was walking on 9th Avenue and I saw one of these, not the big pencil towers, but one of them. And it's impressive, and I thought they have great views. And then I saw they were starting another one just a block north. And I thought these people on the north side of the town paid crazy money for this view, and now they're going to have that view of the suburban guys. But I don't know. It's not nature anymore. It's not this pastoral landscape, but there's something. I guess I put it in the register of a kind of power. And it's a way to, kind of, it miniaturizes the presence of others, so you see others, but they're small, unless you're in Midtown, they're little dots or something like that, so I would still say it creates this kind of spatial barrier between your ability to look onto the landscape and the ability of other people to look at you. That's how I would start. But it's a good potential article. Yes, thank you. All these questions.
Wondering if you could, thanks for that wonderful talk. If you could talk a little bit about maybe the relationship to photography and perhaps the democratization of photography. Because just thinking about, one of the image of the woman overlooking the water and the mountains, of course, takes you back to 19th century landscape paintings. And that, in the 1950s, you have people taking more of their own photographs, and in a way, the picture window, you are making that kind of image as well. And so, do you see any kind of relationship to people making their own kinds of images in different ways in the house or outside?
In the way you just framed that, I could see a point of union in the idea of democratization. That although photography is, with the Kodak, right, you press the button in 1893, right, it becomes cheap enough for mostly ordinary people to have. But maybe, definitely in this idea of the view that I've described, there's this, there's a thread of the possibility of achieving an elite aesthetic on a small site for the middle class. And this, I didn't mention it, but this has everything to do with the rise of the middle class and the sort of borrowing of, the gentry's aesthetic values. So I don't know if then you could argue that the kind of proliferation of portable photography would also be a kind of democratization. It certainly has a resonance in the U.S. Is that where you were going with that question?
I think so. It was just sort of asking you to think about it a little bit more, just because looking at your images made me think about that. And I'm not an expert in any of this material. So.
I mean, there's a lot of facile, I don't want to name names, but there's a lot of facile linking of camera lenses, picture windows, automobile windshields, cinema, as all the same sort of thing, which I resist. I think they're all quite different, but I can also see how you can bring these various things together. So I think, you know, with a couple of beers, we could find a lot of connections. But yeah, and also these are all, you know, ultimately visual representations, right? Yes, sir.
In your review of the horror literature and films, did you account for style and historical style as part of the genesis of the horror? Because I feel like the tropes that I'm used to, it's always a Victorian house. Right. As something that is of the past and therefore haunted. The ghosts are literally coming back to threaten. Also, it's an enclosed house, so it feeds into your transparency argument.
Right. I mean,
modernism would be something about truthfulness and light and
exactly.
You know,
exactly.
It's a gothic horror, isn't it?
Right.
What's that?
It's something. It's like historical style is a horror. Yeah.
Yeah. No. I mean, I did stay away from learning about horror as much as possible, but it is absolutely true that Victorian mansion becomes the icon of the haunted house. I think around the 1920s or so. There's some, you know, Edward Hopper paintings. There's that cartoonist for the New Yorker, Charles Adams, who really makes the first, you know, proper haunted house. So there's the Victorian house is cast as the haunted house in the 1920s or so. Mm-hmm. Earlier, you know, it's not quite that specific, but I think to a sensibility, and the 1920s, it's not that big of a surprise. The American colonial revival is really important. It's a simplified style that actually takes great advantage of these mass-produced elements. So it reminds me a little bit of Pixar doing the first Toy Story makes use of plastic toys, right, as the main characters, because computer animation could only do made skin look plastic at the time. So, right, let's make the characters plastic. And in a way, you could argue that the colonial revival, although it has a lot of other roots, was also a way to make stylistic sense of the fact that there were so many mass-produced elements and you know, subdivisions. So these Victorian houses with lots of oriels and pinnacles and all these elements, the bow window, particularly like I guess something between the Queen Anne and the Second Empire style, ends up getting caught up in this visualization of the house with hidden spaces. It doesn't have that kind of openness of modern, or the simplicity of the colonial revival. So I don't know the extent to which that plays into the horror tropes, but that's definitely, there's a whole kind of genealogy of the haunted house that people have written about. Thanks. That's good.
Sandy, I want to thank you again for such a fascinating talk. But you do have to go on.